Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Michelle Stinnett with SBP. We have a large group, so we ask that you keep your mics muted throughout the presentation. If you have any questions or comments, please type them in the Q&A box and we'll respond to them at the end. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded and we'll be sending the slides out from today's presentation later today, so look out for that in your inbox. SBP is a disaster recovery and resilience nonprofit working to shrink the time between disaster and recovery. As a part of that goal, we've partnered with the Walmart Foundation to present webinars focused on educating disaster recovery leaders to fortify people against unnecessary suffering. At SBP, we have 5 interventions: rebuilding efficiently, sharing our model with other organizations, preparing home and business owners through resilience training, advising municipal and state officials, and advocating for policy changes and improvements to the disaster recovery industry. We believe in a holistic approach to disasters, increasing resilience before and streamlining recovery after. We wanted to make sure that everyone on this call was aware of our upcoming in-person training opportunities. We have our next iteration of the Leader Practitioner course that is going to be May 23rd through 25th in Savannah, Georgia. It's 3 days of in-person instruction. If you are interested, shoot a quick email over to either JR or Hannah on our advised team. And that course is completely paid for through a scholarship by the Walmart Foundation to cover travel expenses, lodging, instruction, and course materials. Also wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of what our upcoming webinars are. Obviously, we are running this one today, but going forward, we have 1 to 2 a month for the rest of 2023. If you are interested in any of those, you can email JR or Hannah, or you can always find those links available on our website. We ask that everyone follows us on LinkedIn. It's one of the easiest ways to get some of our content. We post a whole bunch about what our team with Advise is doing, as well as all of our events. And with that, I will kick it over to Joe, who is going to take you through recovery strategy options.
Thank you, Michelle. Next slide, please. So today we're going to talk about options for building a recovery strategy in the context of a community development block grant disaster recovery program. Next slide, please. So first, we want to talk a bit about the timeline. So this is basically from the date of disaster to the date when you actually start intake for any applicants in your particular programs. You'll notice that your disaster will happen, and then no less than 120 days later, the federal government, through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, will publish a Federal Register notice, which will lay out the rules and regulations for accessing this funding. At that point, the grantee will have about 120 days to do a lot of work and eventually submit an action plan to HUD for their approval. We're going to talk a bit about the Federal Register, and which basically lays out the framework for how you develop your programs. It sets all your rules and guidelines. With that, we'll move to the next slide. So there are basically 3 phases of recovery. You start with chaos. This is the early period where you're trying to get all of your processes in place, figure out what you're doing, get everything submitted to HUD, kind of build your program up. You want to try to move from the chaos phase to the construction phase as quickly as you can. Otherwise, you're not really working towards outcomes. You're just organizing. And once you start your construction process, you eventually want to start the process of figuring out how you're going to close all your cases out. The sooner you figure that out, the better off you'll be at the end. But the bottom line is that you need to get to construction as fast as you possibly can. Next slide, please. So what does HUD care about? In the most general sense, they basically want you to serve an eligible beneficiary meeting an eligible national objective through an eligible activity. So what does that mean exactly? So national objectives through the Department of Housing and Urban Development are benefit to the low to moderate income community, the elimination of slum and blight, and urgent need. Urgent need is basically your catch-all for anything that doesn't fit in the other 2 categories. Low to moderate income is considered 80% or below the area median income for the county in which the individual resides. We talk about eligible activities. We have basically 6 different categories. The three major ones are housing, economic revitalization, and infrastructure. You're also allowed to do public service activities, which are capped at 15% of your total amount of your grant. You have a 5% cap on administration, and then you can have up to 15% for planning. And we'll talk a bit more detail about those later on. Typically, they're going to lay out some spending requirements for you. Normally, almost always, 70% of your grant has to benefit the low to moderate income community. 80% has to be spent in the most impacted and distressed counties, which are defined by HUD. So you may need to make sure you're spending that money wisely and within the time constraints. And there are a number of laws and regulations which you have to comply with as you execute these grants. Next slide, please. So the Federal Register Notice basically starts the process for you. It's going to lay out the framework, and we'll talk a bit about that over the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. So it's the basis for developing your program. It is incredibly complex reading. With that being said, everyone on your team has to know it because it is the legal basis for your grant. Next slide, please. You really need to focus on capturing the key components, and we'll talk about what those are on the next slide. You want to make sure that you are sharing the information with your entire team as well as your political leadership. You want to brief your political leaders on what you can do, and particularly important is what you cannot do with the grant. Otherwise, you'll be trying to be all things for all people, and you will run a very ineffective program. Next slide, please. So here are some of the things that you want to look for in the Federal Register. First of all, you want to identify any particular tasks that you have to complete in order to access your funding. And we basically lay out three separate types of tasks. A specified task is something that you have to do in order to meet the requirements. So you're going to look for words like must or shall as you work through the document. An optional task is something that you have the option to do, but you're not required to do. So this is something where the language may say something like the grantee may do this, or the grantee is encouraged to do this. So while it's not required, it's something that HUD gives you the option to do, so you can do so as you please. And implied tasks are a task that you have to complete in order to meet a specified or optional task. So as an example of that, if the specified task is that the grantee must submit financial certifications by day 120 after the applicability date, you have to have the implied task is that someone on your team has to pull together all that documentation to make sure it's in a state where it is fit for submission to HUD. You're also going to keep an eye out for dollar amounts. So the Federal Register Notice is going to tell you exactly how much money you're going to get. It's also going to tell you exactly how much money you are required to spend in the most impacted and distressed counties. It's going to lay out some particular dates and time limits and milestones. So typically, your applicability date is going to start your clock, and that is about, sorry about that. So that is about 3 to 4 days after it's published in the notice. Then that starts your clock where you have 120 days in order to get everything submitted. The Federal Register Notice is also going to lay out any restrictions, limitations, and constraints that may pertain to your particular grant. Major ones being the administrative cap of 5%, as well as a mitigation requirement of up to or 15% of your total grant amount. And it's also going to provide references to other documents that you have to comply with in addition to this particular Federal Register Notice. So oftentimes it will refer back to other notices that were published in the past, particularly for issues involving duplication of benefits. It will also specify some formatting requirements, and I would encourage you, once you have a grant, a Federal Register Notice released, HUD will publish on their website some checklists that you can use to make sure that you're complying with their formatting requirements and save yourself a lot of heartache when you're trying to get approval from HUD when you submit that document. Next slide, please. So in general, Federal Register Notices tend to be normally almost always about the same with some minor variations. They are getting better. The last major overhaul was in February of 2020. So if you anticipate receiving a grant in the future, you can basically identify about 90% of what you're probably going to have to do by looking at a past notice, and then prepare yourself for whenever your notice is released. There are a number of HUD tools available on the HUD Exchange that can help you navigate both the Federal Register and all of the requirements that you have in order to successfully get access to your grant funding. And if you're still having trouble I would encourage you to reach out to your local HUD rep, talk with other grantees who have gone through this process, or you can reach out to a trusted agent such as our company, SBP, and we'll be happy to try to help you in any way we can with navigating the Federal Register notice. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk a bit about CDBG-DR funding and budgeting. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, that notice is going to lay out some requirements such as a 5% limit on administrative costs, a 15% limit on planning. There will be a requirement with all future allocations to expend 15% on mitigation activities. And it's absolutely critical that you know what is administrative cost and what is not. You really want to try to use program delivery or activity delivery costs to your benefit as much as possible. And as you're developing your budget, you really need to try to budget that over a 6-year period because under best case scenario, most grantees are trying to reach that 6-year time frame. You don't want to get to the end of your grant and not have any administrative dollars left to pay for your staff as you're trying to navigate that process. Next slide, please. So here are some examples of what are administrative costs. Okay, sorry about that. So on the left-hand side, you'll see some examples of administrative costs, and on the right-hand side, you can see some examples of activity delivery costs. So normally, almost always, most grantees default to charging things as administrative costs when the reality is, unless you're actually doing those elements on that left-hand side, such as developing policies and procedures, or you're paying for kind of your general oversight staff, almost all the activities that your staff or your contractors are doing should be classified as activity delivery costs. So unless proven otherwise, I would encourage you to default to activity delivery costs, and we're going to show you some tips and tricks on how you can track that as you move forward through your grant cycle. Next slide, please. So when you develop your budget in DRGR, you cannot have activity delivery cost as a separate activity. Therefore, you want to take your activity budget and add a percentage for activity delivery costs so that you are properly able to account for all the costs associated with your staff helping to manage those programs and activities. So what we typically did when I was managing grants was we would take the total project cost and then add an additional 2.5% to account for all of my internal staff time that would go towards it as activity delivery cost. But your percentage may vary depending on the complexity of your staff or your activity. Next slide, please. Here's a really simple example of how you can track your time in order to make sure that you're not just charging everything to admin. You do not have to get specific and reference particular cases, but you do have to have your staff document on a timesheet on a day-by-day basis, hourly, what activity delivery time they have allocated, and then that needs to be signed off by a supervisor, and that is sufficient for HUD when it comes to determining whether or not the cost is admin versus activity delivery. Next slide, please. Here is a simple example of how you can budget over a 6-year cycle, and I would encourage you to pay attention to the bottom of your screen where you'll see that your first year is mainly going to be your administrative cost and developing your policies and procedures, setting up your process flows so that you have an effective program. Once you approach your second year, you then want to get to a stable state where you have everything squared away and you're actively in the construction process, and then be prepared to wind down as you approach year 6. So it's really important that you budget your time this way in order to have an effective program. Next slide, please. So the appropriation law states that funds have to be used for necessary expenses related to disaster relief, long-term recovery, and restoration of those 3 major areas, which are infrastructure, housing, and economic revitalization. Furthermore, the major difference between CDBG traditional and CDBG DR is that you have to address a disaster-related impact, either directly or indirectly, in a presidentially declared county for the particular disaster. It has to be a CDBG eligible activity, which is a very, very broad category, and you have to meet one of those 3 national objectives. Next slide, please. So that's basically the framework that you're going to work in. Now we're going to talk a bit about some of the options that you have through the lens of housing, economic revitalization, infrastructure, public services. Next slide, please. Before we get into that, there are basically 3 different models that you can use when you're deciding to implement your particular program. The first of those is a grantee centralized model. That's where the grantee provides direct goods and services to an eligible beneficiary. You could also employ a subrecipient model where the grantee is going to develop the funding and the policy. They will then pass that funding to a unit of local government or some other subrecipient who will then provide those direct goods and services to an eligible beneficiary. You can also take the approach of using a combination of the two. And it's a general rule of thumb that I like to use is that if your activity is people-centric, it's best to manage that internally as a centralized model. If it is thing-centric, then you're generally safe to use a subrecipient model because a sewer pipe doesn't care how it's treated through the process, whereas you want to have consistency with all of your citizens. So if you have people involved, I would encourage you to use a centralized model. Next slide, please. So first, we're going to take a look at some housing options. There are a number of different activities you can undertake, which we will go into detail on the further slides. But first of which you can do is a stick-built home and a mobile home repair or replacement. You can do buyouts or acquisitions or relocations. You can do new construction. You can do elevation as an eligible housing activity, and you can do rental housing repair or new construction, whether that is single-family rental housing or multifamily rental housing. Next slide, please. So let's first talk a bit about some tips and tricks with buyouts and acquisitions. So it's absolutely critical if you're working outside of the floodplain that you define your disaster risk reduction area. And be careful when you define that disaster risk reduction area because you may restrict your ability to do other activities in that particular area if your disaster risk reduction area is too expansive. It can also get a bit tricky when trying to define the particular national objective that you want to use, because unless your homeowner is a low to moderate income individual, it's hard to use the LMI benefit if you're buying out a particular area, unless you can prove that the area that remains once you demolish those homes will directly benefit a larger area that is defined as low to moderate income. So it can get a bit tricky there. When talking about the value, you have 2 options of the value that you pay out to an eligible applicant when you decide to buy their home from them. You can use the pre-disaster value or you can use the post-disaster value. And there are some pros and cons to each. And it has gotten particularly tricky in the post-COVID environment with the boom in the housing market over the past several years. So you may want to consider providing some incentives. You can provide incentives for a number of different reasons. You can provide an incentive if individuals are low to moderate income. You could provide a moving incentive to help give them some seed money to find somewhere else to go. And one way that we worked around challenges with housing costs being higher in the current market versus pre-disaster is that we did what was known as a market adjustment incentive. So we didn't want to disadvantage folks who could otherwise sell their home to somebody in the open market because we wanted to buy out those assets. So we would provide the difference between pre-disaster value and current market value through that market adjustment incentive. And it allowed us to basically use both pre-disaster value and post-disaster value in the same particular program. You also want to be mindful of what the end use of the property is going to be, because it needs to be maintained as perpetual green space if it's going to be a buyout. If you have other designs for it, that can get a bit trickier through the acquisition process. Next slide, please. So when executing a repair or replacement program, here are some things that you want to keep in mind. It's really, really important that you are managing the expectations of your applicants, because this isn't like, you're coming in with a full home remodel with, granite countertops and all that good stuff. You're really just looking to get your citizens back into housing that is safe, sanitary, and secure. With that being said, it's absolutely critical that you develop some housing quality standards. What we did when I was managing the South Carolina program is that we didn't really care whether the damage was disaster damage or deferred maintenance. We had a standard where we would repair the home to the exact specification in every single room, regardless of what the source of the damage was, and that was perfectly acceptable to HUD. You need to be careful when you're doing repairs in the floodplain, because in the event that the work that you're doing is greater than 50% of the fair market value of the home, you are required to elevate that structure, which can often get incredibly complex, particularly if you're dealing with older homes. Last thing you want to do is try to lift the home up and then it falls apart. And when talking about that 50% rule, it's not just the money that you're going to be putting into it, but it's any funds post-disaster that the citizen or any volunteer labor may have gone into it that has to go in that calculation. So as a general rule of thumb, we would be really, really mindful to do a much higher quality damage assessment to try to account for unknown variables, so that we didn't run into situations where we may get started and it's under 50%, but then we have several change orders later that lead to over 50%, and then we end up having to elevate the home midway through the process. So it's normally much easier to rebuild from the ground up rather than elevate existing structures. HUD requires you to use a green building standards checklist. However, with that being said, there are some ways that you can get around some of the requirements that are going to make your repairs incredibly costly. What we did in South Carolina is that we put a memo in place that basically said, if we touch it, we will comply with all the standards. If we do not touch a particular area, such as the crawl space, then we would not comply with standards for insulating the crawl space, because it was cost prohibitive for us, and that seemed to work well for us. It's really, really important that you as the grantee control your inspection process, both at the front end with the damage assessment and then at the back end with the final inspection with photographic evidence that goes into your particular system of record. That's going to be critical for success in your program. And you want to make sure that you're micromanaging the warranty process as well. If you turn that over to your contractors, they are always going to say something is not a warranty issue, because they do not want to go out and redo work without getting paid for it. So make sure that you're controlling that, and you have incentives in place that require your contractors to comply with the warranty process. One tool that you can use is withholding a certain percentage of the total award amount until after the expiration of your warranty period. And that seems to work well because they have additional incentive to comply with you. And then it's important that you provide an administrative out for projects that will exceed any action plan benefit caps. So you're required in your action plan to say the maximum amount that you will give to a particular beneficiary for a particular activity. You can, however, say on a case-by-case basis, you may exceed that cap. Because what you find is that you're going to run into situations where it makes sense to exceed whatever cap that you put in place rather than tear it down and build something new. So you want to make sure that you have the ability to administratively do that without having to amend your action plan every time you run into a project that exceeds your cap. Next slide, please. So with elevations of existing structures, I would strongly encourage you to conduct an elevation viability analysis and a cost benefit analysis and make sure that it makes sense. Elevations of existing structures are both incredibly expensive as well as incredibly complex, and oftentimes you run into situations where you go to elevate and you end up with a situation where you run into termite damage or some other issue with older homes, and you end up spending way more rebuilding at an elevated standard than you would have if you had just tore it down and built it from the ground up. You need to be making sure that you're elevating to, at minimum, the base flood elevation plus 2 feet. However, if you have a situation where your known flooding level far exceeded that, I would strongly encourage you to elevate to at least above the known flooding level, so that you're not setting yourself up for the same situation in the future with the damage. Make sure that you account for any hidden damage whenever you're conducting that viability analysis, because the last thing you want to do is start lifting it up and it falls apart. And then it's critical that you over communicate the flood insurance requirements. If you're working in the floodplain and you provide these federal dollars and they do not maintain flood insurance, they are not eligible for assistance in the event that they are damaged again. So it's absolutely critical that the flood insurance requirements are communicated, and they do not only apply to the particular individual, but they stick to the property. So having some sort of requirement that there's a notification in the event that the property is sold will be important as well. Next slide, please. So with rental repair or rental new construction, it can get a bit tricky when meeting the low to moderate income benefit national objective, because it's not just when you complete construction, but you actually have to track having the tenant move into the home. That's what triggers the national objective being met. You really want to, at all costs, avoid enriching slumlords. So one way you can do that is by setting the maximum number of units you will serve, as well as a reasonable maximum dollar amount, so that you're not just rebuilding a ton of units for a particular slumlord. When you have new rental construction, it's very important to identify who is going to operate that facility, because you as the grantee likely will not be around for as long as that property. So having someone like a housing authority or a nonprofit or a private developer is critical. And you also want to make sure that you're setting and tracking affordability periods from 5 to 20 years, depending on the size of units that you're undertaking. So having some mechanism in place to track that beyond the life of the grant is going to be critical. And then URA requirements. So in the event that you have a tenant that is displaced, you need to know that, because that triggers the federal cross-cutting URA requirements, which can be incredibly expensive, but you have to comply with that. And you may want to consider trying to leverage some matching funds from the owner in the event that you want to try to serve more folks through your rental program. Next slide, please. So here are some considerations that you might want to have when figuring out how to develop your eligibility requirements for your housing program. When it comes to ownership, if you're doing an owner-occupied program, you want to maybe have ownership at the time of the disaster as well as the time of application. And then one thing that is critical is having in place some sort of legal aid to ensure that your applicants have a will, because the last thing you want to do is repair their home or build them a new home, and then they die in the process, and then you have a home that is sitting in probate where you can't turn the keys over to anyone for a year to 2 years. So using your public service activity, which we'll talk about a bit more in the next couple slides, is critical to ensuring that you are protecting the investment that you're putting into that home. When you try to determine disaster damage, you have several different options. You can use a FEMA verified as your best approach, which means they applied for FEMA and FEMA gave them some sort of funding. You can have a grantee verified, where you go out and you make a damage assessment, you take photographs and you document the disaster damage, or you can have applicant verified disaster damage, where they document and they send that to you. Think about the types of structures that you want to allow in your particular housing programs. Single family, multifamily, mobile homes, or townhomes. Now, there are additional requirements when you deal with multifamily homes, and HUD defines multifamily as anything above 4 units. So duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes do not count as multifamily. They count as single family. But multifamily homes trigger the Davis-Bacon Act, which has additional documentation and tracking requirements for you as the grantee. You need to ask when your applicants apply if they had a tenant living in their home, both either at the time of the disaster or at the time that they applied, because if they did so, then that will likely trigger URA, and you'll have some additional costs associated with serving that particular applicant. And then be mindful of other issues that could potentially delay your project advancing. Some problems that we ran into were that people had unresolved tax bills, which would not allow us to draw building permits, or would not allow us to get a certificate of occupancy. So we were basically held hostage until the applicant was able to pay their taxes. So you want to try to avoid that as much as possible on the front end to ensure that you have a smooth process throughout. Next slide, please. So here are some options that you have for the economic revitalization activity. You can provide business loans or grants to try to spur investment in disaster impacted areas. You can provide job training, which also will likely count as a public service, which is subject to that 15% cap of your total amount of funding. You can do a facade improvement program. That's where you may have an area that you designate as slum and blighted as a result of the disaster. You can go in and, provide some painting, put new awnings in, those types of activities. Really broadly are generalized efforts that attract or retain workers in devastated communities, which also will likely count as public service activities. And there are total number of jobs tied to the particular dollar amount that you provide. So be mindful of that if that's something that you want to undertake. And you can also do acquisitions or buyouts. of commercial property through the economic revitalization activity. I want to talk a bit about job training though for a moment, because there's an opportunity here to link your economic revitalization activity and your public service to your housing program if you're able to plan ahead far enough. You could develop a job training program where you train semi-skilled laborers or skilled laborers, HVAC, all the other trades, and then require your contractors to hire those graduates of your program to work in your particular disaster. That way you have the local community helping themselves to recover. So that's something you may want to consider if you're able to get that planned early on. And keep in mind that these recoveries typically take 6 years at best. So while it may seem like it takes a long time to get workers trained, I promise you there will be work for them when they get out, because you will still be building in your program once they graduate. Next slide, please. So here are the general infrastructure options that you have. It's basically the repair or replacement of public facilities. You can move public facilities. You can buy them out. You can do some dike, dam, stream, river, bank repairs. You can also use your CDBG-DR funds as the local match requirement for hazard mitigation grant programs or public assistance match. So typically there's a 25% requirement that the local government has to pay, and CDBG-DR is a really, really unique federal funding source because it can be used as that local match. And you want to keep in mind that buildings for the general conduct of government are prohibited whenever you're trying to use CDBG-DR funds to repair or improve them. That's basically any facility that's primarily administrative, judicial, or legislative in nature, unless you are trying to remove material or architectural barriers to accessibility. Next slide, please. So here are the options, some of the options that you have available under the public service activity, which is subject to a 15% cap of your total funding. I talked a bit about linking job training to your housing program early on, but you can also use it for fair housing counseling. I would encourage you to provide some housing counseling so that you don't run into a situation where you provide your applicants with a new asset and then they mismanagement and they lose it several years down the road. Legal aid is also an eligible public service activity. So please, please, please have some sort of service where you help your citizens ensure that they have a will if you're going to serve them, because in a large enough program, you will have situations where applicants will die in the process, and you need to make sure that you have a clear chain of where that property should go. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about subrecipients. Next slide, please. So what is a subrecipient? I think the best way to illustrate that is through this example, which basically shows you how one particular organization, and that's SBP, can be either a subrecipient, a contractor, or a beneficiary. So the example we use for a subrecipient is where the subrecipient is designated by the state to administer a disaster case management program funded through DR funds. The company SBP could be hired through a competitive procurement process to provide construction management services, or SBP could be disaster impacted and then receive funds to make repairs. So really the distinction is how the grantee defines the organization, and how they are procured is what determines whether or not they're a subrecipient or a contractor. Next slide, please. So whenever you're going about the process of trying to get subrecipients into your program, you need to make sure that you have a strong subrecipient agreement. You can just push out funding to local governments, nonprofits, or other organizations that you want to conduct work in your program, or you can have a competitive application requirement. You can also competitively procure a subrecipient, which allows you to bid out work or allows you to assign work instead of bidding out work, which saves you a ton of time whenever you're trying to actually get homes built. And really the linchpin of success when dealing with subrecipients is having a strong subrecipient agreement, which is basically a contract between you as the grantee and whoever it is that you are hiring to do that work. But keep in mind that if you pass along your responsibilities to the subrecipient, at the end of the day, HUD is only going to hold you responsible as the grantee. So it's important that you stay on top of your subrecipients. Next slide, please. So here are some questions you want to ask yourself as you are working through your subrecipient process. You want to identify who your potential subrecipients are, whether those are units of general local government, nonprofit groups, or for-profit groups. Any are eligible. You want to clearly specify in your subrecipient agreement what the activity they will undertake is. You want to set clear deadlines and milestones in your subrecipient agreement. And then you want to clearly identify the geographic area where that subrecipient will work. But it's absolutely critical that just like HUD looks at you to determine whether or not you have the capacity, the capability to administer your particular program, you do the exact same thing for your subrecipient. So conduct an analysis to determine whether they are the best fit for that activity and really basically make them create their own implementation plan for how they intend to do it. And then you as the grantee should clearly define all the policies and procedures and then specify all of the eligibility requirements. Otherwise, you may run into a situation where you're having to pass along your administrative funds to your subrecipient, which we'll go into more detail about on the next slide. So you have two approaches that you can take when deciding how you're going to fund a subrecipient. So a simple subrecipient execute a specific activity which is outlined in your action plan, where you set all the policies and procedures, and you are the only organization who's responsible for grant administration. There's also a situation where you can have a method of distribution subrecipient. That's where you as the grantee may say, I'm going to give $5 million to County A, $5 million to County B, $5 million to County C, and I'm going to let them figure out how they want to spend it, however they want to. If you do that, they are eligible to receive some of your administrative funds. So I would strongly encourage you to be cautious as you do that, because you can quickly have a lot of your admin dollars eaten up. But all activities conducted by simple subrecipients are activity delivery costs. So do not let them eat away your admin costs if they are a simple subrecipient. Next slide, please. So some final tips on this is that you want to set really clear expectations in your subrecipient agreement. Make sure that you have clear deadlines and milestones that they have to meet. You need to maintain communication with your subrecipients and actively monitor them. If you see that they're struggling, don't wait until a year later to start corrective action. Stay in communication and get the work in up front. That way you're not in a political fight a year or 2 years down the road where you're trying to draw funds back from one of your subrecipients. And then the bottom line with subrecipients is that the subrecipient agreement is absolutely critical to success. And if you mess this up or your subrecipient messes this up, HUD is going to hold you responsible, not your subrecipient. Next slide, please. At this point, I will take any questions that you might have.
If anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we will read them out loud for Joe to answer for you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Next chart, please. Well, thank you so much, Joe and Michelle. That was an amazing webinar. We can't thank you enough for the great work that both of you do in working across disaster recovery. I did have a couple of notes from several people on the webinar who were interested in attending the upcoming Leader Practitioner course. We will do this in Savannah, Georgia. We believe it's a great education for anybody working in disaster recovery. We think that you learn just as much from your peers as you'll ever learn from the cadre. Again, this is paid for by the Walmart Foundation. Your travel expenses, lodging, and instruction course materials are paid, and we do reimburse travel up to $650 per participant. We'd love to meet you and get to know you and spend some time with you. Let's go to the next chart, please. And here, next month, we'd ask that you join us on February 22nd. We will, if you can't find the links or if we're having problems with broken links, please go to our website. We know that they're right there. And webinar, of course, WebEx is an interesting conundrum that we have to work through every month. But we are holding a great deal of webinars over the next year. This is all, again, paid for by the Walmart Foundation. So I would encourage you to join us on the webinars. We're going to do contracting in February. And then I am personally really excited about our March 8th environmental review piece. We've got some real expertise coming in here to talk about environmental review. really, really proud of that. And then, of course, as we move into June and July, we will devote at least one of these to mitigation for those of you in the mitigation business. So with that, let's go to the next chart. And here, folks, we just ask you to join us on LinkedIn. You can be our friend on LinkedIn. I think that's how that works. So we'd love to have you, and please join us. And we like, this is where we really keep up with a lot of things going on in the disaster recovery world, specifically in our portion of it. And so just ask you to join us there. Next chart, please.
That's it.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. And back to you, Michelle.
Yes, seeing no other questions in the Q&A box, if you guys do have any specific questions for me or Joe or anyone on our team, please just reach out to us via email. After the end of this, I will be sending out the slides to everyone that attended. So if you have any questions, you can just reply to that email and we'll get you taken care of. But with that, I will let everyone have a little bit back of their day. Thank you guys so much.